Meanwhile, the UN Security Council has held an emergency meeting in response to the missile strike on Ukraine's biggest children's hospital. We heard about it earlier. Russian diplomats have denied responsibility for the blast in Kyiv, which came during the largest wave of Russian attacks in months. Ukrainian officials say Moscow deliberately targeted the hospital. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, people are still coming to grips with the scale of the destruction.
Day 2 of the cleanup at Ukraine's largest children's hospital. Hundreds of patients, their loved ones and staff were in the facility when the missile hit on Monday. The facility's director explained the impact of the strike.
The most significant loss is the loss of life. Unfortunately, we lost a highly professional doctor who was very dedicated to children and prevented major casualties. We lost a young, qualified specialist as well. Of course, we also lost the building. It's completely destroyed. Dialysis for kidney failure and acute toxicity was conducted in that building. Now there's no building left and no equipment. We also lost critical infrastructure. We lost the ability to supply electricity to both the new and old buildings.
Ukraine has published photos of what it says are recovered fragments of a Russian cruise missile that struck the children's hospital. Russia denies its involvement. UN experts back up Kyiv's claims that Moscow was to blame.
Hospitals have special protection under international humanitarian law. Intentionally directing attacks against a protected hospital is a war crime, and perpetrators must be held to account. Mr. President, these incidents are part of a deeply concerning pattern of systemic attacks harming healthcare and other civilian infrastructure across Ukraine.
The hospital strike was part of a barrage of missile attacks in different parts of Ukraine on Monday. Dozens of people were killed. The Ukrainian president vowed to retaliate. On Tuesday, Moscow says Ukrainian drone strikes killed at least one person, set fire to 2 power substations and an oil depot in several Russian regions. Back in Kyiv, there's hope the NATO summit in Washington will lead to an increase in support for Ukraine and, in turn, better air defences to avoid more bloodshed.
And we can get more on this from military analyst Marina Miron from King's College London. Hi, Marina. Now, the Kremlin is claiming that the children's hospital in Kyiv was hit by fragments of a Ukrainian air defence missile. The UN and the Ukrainian Secret Service say it was a Russian missile. What more can you tell us about this?
Good day, Anya. It is too soon to tell what exactly happened, and I think that what is required is an international investigation team that's impartial in order to be able to determine, in order to be able to look at the destruction, to look at the fragments, to look at the people who were around the facility, to interview them. So I think there is no simple answer to that. And of course, the accountable person should be found, because we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, so state actors. But we need to look much deeper than that. Who in the chain of command was responsible for that strike? Who gave the order? Was it based on false intelligence? So I think that it's much more complicated than it appears to be in the first place. And I believe either way, the international community has a responsibility to ensure that there is proper protection for civilians in any war.
OK, so an investigation still needed, but obviously the damage is huge. What does this tell us about Ukraine's air defense systems?
Well, this is problematic because the Ukrainian side believed that they had sufficient air defenses in order to protect Kyiv, and that shows a huge vulnerability gap when it comes to protecting the capital, meaning that President Zelensky might be requesting more air defense batteries from NATO specifically because the summit is now about to take place. So I think NATO leaders will have to think about how to better support Ukraine, at least when it comes to the short term, given the fact that the Russians still have enough capabilities to conduct long-range strikes and will certainly use this gap in air defenses in order to strike different targets, including those located in the cities, including the capital.
Speaking of the NATO summit that is coming up in Washington, how significant is the timing of this attack coming just before the NATO summit?
Well, I think it's pretty significant from what it looks like. So right now, the international community is condemning Russia. As I said, investigation should be conducted in order to find out what happens. But as it seems, the national leaders will probably want to support Kyiv more than they have, specifically because this NATO summit is supposed to discuss what is going to happen with Ukraine and prepare for a possibility of Donald Trump winning the US elections, which would be a huge blow for NATO and a possible blow to Ukraine as well. So they might be looking at delivering more or pledging more aid to Kyiv before the US presidential elections. And I think these strikes play into the whole picture, showing that Ukraine cannot withstand the Russian attacks without outside support, and that support is needed urgently.
Military analyst Marina Miron from King's College London. Marina, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Let's cross over to DW's Nick Connolly in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Nick, emergency workers have been digging through the rubble at the children's hospital. Have there been any new signs of survivors?
Terry, there was a report overnight of a young boy who was found in the rubble dead. So far, no good news since we were there last night. It is incredibly difficult work, very, very heavy concrete slabs that are basically having to be drilled through to get to what is believed to be the cellar underneath that unit of the hospital where people are believed to have been sheltering. It is also incredibly difficult to tell quite how many people they should be looking for at this point, because this was an air raid. People have 5 or 10 minutes maximum to get to safety, so no one really knows who went where and which potential kind of air raid shelter they were in. Overall, we have those figures from yesterday, 27 people believed killed in Kyiv alone, more than 100 wounded. Those figures expected still to rise. So it is a pretty somber morning here in Kyiv, a day of mourning. Concerts, any other kind of entertainment is banned for today, and people, once again, pretty painfully aware of quite how vulnerable they are, even here in Ukraine's capital, the place that is the best protected in all of the country.
Well, following that wave of Russian attacks on Ukraine, Nick, Ukraine's President Zelensky, he promised retaliation. What more can you tell us about that?
So we had a message, there was a post by Ukraine's internal security agency, SBU, which also has been carrying out operations in Russia since the beginning of this war, saying very clearly that they knew not only who had carried out these attacks, referring to pilots and the crews that programmed the cruise missiles, but also the people with the responsibility for giving these commands, people further up the food chain, as it were, within the Russian military. They knew their names and where they lived. We have seen attacks and assassinations of people on Russian territory. Those have for now largely been Ukrainians who've then gone to collaborate with the Russian side and gone to live in Russia, but also Russian military personnel have been shot and assassinated in various ways on Russian territory. So that is the expectation that going forward, that might be something that Ukraine would try to do, and certainly a message to try and intimidate and remind Russian crews, air crews, and also the kind of support staff that Ukraine, unlike Russia, is pretty good at projecting power behind the front lines. They have lots of people who, Russians who maybe are sympathetic to Ukraine, also Ukrainian expats, people who live in Russia who are able to provide information. So they are trying to really make it clear that this has a cost and that this is not something that Ukraine is simply going to move on from and forget.
The Russian strikes came on the eve of a NATO summit in the US. Nick, Ukraine's president is due to attend that summit. Do you do the attacks lend weight to Volodymyr Zelensky's appeal for more allied support?
Well, from a Ukrainian perspective, there is this kind of depressing tendency that it takes pictures of the magnitude and of the kind of awfulness of what we saw yesterday at the Children's Hospital to really move perceptions and to accelerate decision-making in kind of Western government bureaucracies. There were posts from, we had ministers from the Netherlands who are providing Patriot spare parts and also those F-16 jets that Ukraine so desperately needs also to shoot down missiles, saying that they would double down on their efforts to send things faster. We had American government spokespeople saying that there would be a clear signal, a kind of response from Washington to Putin after yesterday's attacks, albeit no change on the position that for now Ukraine is only allowed to use US weapons against Russian territory in a kind of 100-kilometer border strip, not allowed to use US-supplied weapons to attack, for instance, Russian airfields that are used to launch attacks on Ukraine. So that's still a disappointment from Ukraine, but hope here that now slowly this country is going to get more of those Patriot systems that have proved so important in defending Ukrainian cities, but which, you know, currently they only have a handful of, and which means when they do shoot down missiles, they're shooting down missiles over cities and debris is falling on people's heads at great danger to those people going about their daily business.
Nick, thank you very much. Our correspondent Nick Connolly there in Kyiv.